Sing of moon rays on the rain, sing of love not in vain. Every grief, every wrong has its ending in song. Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Teach all men how to speak clouds of gloom into light. Without silence, what is song? Without night, where is dawn? Were it not for men's woes, who would smile at the rose? Nightingale, nightingale, sing of joy through the night. Let each tone silence groan, earth and heaven unite. Morning laughter, evening tears, snow and blossoms all fade. Joy must sing in the night to face change unafraid. Nightingale, nightingale,
So the reading from Whispers from Eternity.
Devendra, the microphone.
Oh, the microphone is here. I'm just... Sorry. Should I test it? Okay. This is the topic, burn thou my frailties in the furnace of trials. Master says, in the furnace of trials, the ore of my life is being purified. The fire of experience melts away all my delusions' dross. O divine artisan, burn away all my impurities, bring out in me the steel of endurance, and hone it to a fine edge by deep calmness. Forge in me from the tempered steel of mental balance, sharp swords of self-control and firm tenacity. With the weapon of inner equilibrium, teach me to fight every enemy of distraction. Om.
Welcome, everybody, to this afternoon's Satsang. Before I start, I just wanted to mention that we had a little meeting with the different acharyas and the service leaders this week, and what we're going to do with our satsangs, weekly satsangs from here on, certainly until the end of the year, and then we'll reevaluate and see how it goes, is that we're going to take as the topic of our satsang this in the same way that the other Ananda centers around the world do. They take a topic from the reading of Rays of the One Light. Swami had written commentaries on Bible, Bhagavad Gita, and has a topic for each one. And at Ananda Village, when he first started doing this, he thought it would be good to have a focus for the topic of the week, and so I thought we would start adopting that as well. Although it doesn't mean that we might not vary, because whoever's giving the service of the day, ultimately they can speak, whatever is inspiring to them. But sometimes, just one might as well take the topic that's assigned and see what we can do with it. So today's topic is, why offer God anything when God has everything? And so I was trying to see if I could weave that in, because I thought I'd better start by addressing the topic, just to set a good example and see if I could weave it in to what I wanted to say. But I was actually this week. I was here last Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday morning, and on Thursday morning here we have a meditation from 6 until 9 o'clock. It's our 3-hour meditation once a week, and normally on a day-to-day basis this is fine with me, because I usually get up at about 5:30 every morning anyway, and then get ready and then start meditating about 6 is my normal time anyway. So, but it so happened that last Thursday, for some reason I didn't sleep very well, and when I woke up at 5:30, I really didn't want to get up. I just really, it was one of those days, which I'm sure all of us have, is sometimes we have to get up in the morning and we go to sadhana and we just want to turn over and go back to sleep. And we just don't want to get out of bed. And it was one of those days where I just didn't want to get up. Oh God, it's dark out still. And all of these things were going through my mind. But finally I said, no, obviously I got to get up and I'll do it. And I jumped up and I took a shower and then I felt good and I went. But it was that momentary, I think we all recognize it, that momentary moment when we're in there and it's sort of like, oh, I could just, keep on going, that I overcame and then continued on and came to the meditation in the morning. And then everything was fine. I was thinking about this and this, to me, that was you might say a metaphor of the spiritual path. And I thought it's a metaphor of what happens to all of us in some fashion or another. And so with thinking about that, it got me started thinking about this topic today. And the metaphor is there's always a struggle. It seems like doing those things that we ought to do, in this case, getting up and meditating, and there's always a certain struggle, an effort has to be put into it. To reach our highest potential, it's never as if we can just slide gracefully and easily in that direction. Usually, often, sometimes maybe the grace is given us to do that, but it's often a struggle to do the right thing for us. If we suffer, if something bothers us in life, we have to use a little bit of willpower to respond in the right way, not get angry. It's easy sometimes to get angry, but to do the right thing and to respond in the right way takes a little bit of effort. And if you go through your experiences in daily life, living the spiritual life, there's always a bit of intentional activity that we have to do to raise ourselves up. And we might say that the spiritual life really is this struggle between wanting to do that which is the easy thing that just comes, and taking that little bit of extra effort to put energy into something to raise ourselves up. And this struggle between these two forces manifests and plays itself out every day of our lives. The spiritual life is something that takes a bit of effort. We have to put effort. You could say, I've often used this in my classes, that it's like the table of life is tilted just a little bit, whereas the ball rolls in a certain direction if there's no energy applied, and that usually is down. In order to get that ball to move up, it takes a little bit of push interjected into life to get that ball to move up. And this is why in all spiritual literature, the spiritual life, the spiritual quest is always described as an ascent, a rising up. And this is why you also find that the spiritual life is always described as a bit of a struggle as well, to do the right thing and to act in the right way. And of course, what is the most famous, certainly in this culture here we're in, description of this struggle? It's the struggle of the Bhagavad Gita, where you have the forces of the Kurus versus the forces of the Pandavas. This is that struggle between, as Yogananda said, those forces within us that are taking us outward toward materialism versus those other forces that are pulling us back or trying to uplift our consciousness. And Arjuna, of course, faced with this struggle, the every man, the every disciple, faced with this struggle, doesn't want to fight. He tried to, and there's many reasons why he doesn't want to fight, but one of them is this tendency of us not, why is it always a struggle? And it's no matter where you are on the spectrum of the spiritual life, that question is going to be there. There's a struggle, except as long as, you could say, as long as we're embodied in the ego. And until ultimately we can transcend that, then of course we are in a state of grace. But as long as there's that ego there, that ego impulse, which is the impulse of the life force being in this body, there's always that struggle. Even the great saint, who's still not quite at that state yet, he's struggling too. And he's willing to take up that fight and struggle. You could say and so this force between the two, now, if I remember my Bhagavad Gita right, Karna, first son, represents that impulse to seek happiness. Firstborn. You could say it's the first impulse of all of us, that of the soul, the desire, that impulse to seek happiness. And who is his rival? Arjuna, fiery self-control. You see, this impulse to seek happiness, of course, is a soul impulse also. We seek God is ultimately the answer. But an unguided impulse sometimes goes in the other direction. So in the story, of course, Karna aligns himself with the Kurus, the forces that are going outward, because that is the initial impulse, that's where it wants to go. And so consequently, it's Arjuna, of course, his rival, that self-control. And again, here you see, there's always this struggle. It's emphasized in the Bhagavad Gita, illustrating that struggle between those two forces. And you could say, yes, it is. The first impulse is to seek happiness, or to seek, and you could even say it in a spiritual sense. That first happiness, that first impulse of all of us, you could say the devotee is to seek God. But you could say perhaps more important than that one, that impulse. Yes, we have that impulse. But perhaps more important is also the necessity for the willingness to take up the fight. Because there's lots of people, and we see all the time, I want God, I want God, I want God. But they're not willing to do anything about it, to put it into practice. So consequently, a little bit of obstacle, a little bit of opposition comes, a little bit of temptation here, there, and they have no discipline, you might say, that fiery self-control to be able to follow through on that. And this is what we see so often. So we have to have, you might say, to actualize that first principle, we have to have that first principle also. The next principle, you might say, is courage. And this is why Sri Yukteswar, in his Holy Science, he makes that point, is that we have to have courage. And this is where Swamiji, in his early discipleship lessons, he starts with that quality of the devotee, the disciple, courage. We have to be courageous enough to take up the fight, to be able to ultimately win that battle. Now, there was a story I remember illustrating this point. There was a fellow disciple, seeker. He went up into the jungle, perhaps, or maybe in the mountains. He found a yogi. And he found this yogi after much searching. And he asked the yogi, I want to take up the spiritual life. Should I? Should I take up the spiritual life? And the yogi looks at him and says, no, I don't think you should. For one, if you have to ask that question, you're probably not ready. Because if you really were committed, you wouldn't even ask that question. You would do it. So the yogi says, no, you shouldn't. He says, but if you really want to, if you're going to, you've got to go all the way. There's no middle ground. You have to go all the way. So here we are. We've answered that question, and we are taking that step. Oh, we're supposed to do that ceremony, and I forgot the vow. Can somebody go get it for me? I left it at home. Can you go get the brahmachari vow? I don't know where it is. I left it at home on my desk. I don't know where it is. The book. Get the book. I'm sorry. Here I came, and I forgot the darn thing at home on my desk. The Renunciate book. Yeah. Okay. A minor interlude. It's part of the story. But I was just saying to him, if you're going to take up the path, this is what he said. The yogi said, you got to go all the way. Because otherwise you're in that middle ground, you see. You're in that middle ground. So this story, if we take up the path, we have to go all the way. And if we do that, something is required along that way. We have to expect to sacrifice. We have to expect to sacrifice. And many people take up the spiritual path because they say, oh, I'm going to find God and my life is going to be better. I'm going to be happy. This is, the scriptures say, and they're not willing to sacrifice. And Swamiji has often said, no good thing has ever been accomplished in life without tapasya. Nothing. And if we're not willing to sacrifice, we're not going to be able, we shouldn't begin on that spiritual path. Now, of course, we're impelled to do it, and so we do anyway. But oftentimes we have the expectation that then it's going to be, there is no, there is no sacrifice there. God will somehow come to my aid, which He will, but yet I don't necessarily have to give up anything. Now, this leads me to this morning's reading, which is, in each of the readings every week, there is given a Bhagavad Gita reading. And so I've recommended that we try to use that reading, or if we want a better one, we pick a different one. So the reading this morning is from the fourth chapter. Krishna says, those who partake of the nectar remaining after a sacrifice attain to the infinite spirit. That person, however, who makes no sacrifices, never truly succeeds in enjoying even the blessings of this material world. How then could he attain happiness in subtler realms? For if one's not willing to sacrifice. Now, we have to understand, of course, that sacrifice is meant on a little bit more than just that outward ritual we offer something into the fire, or perhaps we pray to God, God, if you give me a son, I will give you 2 lakh rupee at the temple, or something like that. It's more than that sort of thing. I remember the first year that we were here, the villagers liked to sacrifice chickens, and because something would go wrong, and so they would take one of Yashwant's chickens, and then they would, and then they'd have a nice chicken dinner. But something, when things needed propitiating, they would sacrifice. We asked them, say, don't sacrifice the chickens on the property. If you want to sacrifice, go, elsewhere. But so we don't do that so much anymore. But this understanding of sacrifice on that level, or a sort of a prayer where we say, Lord, if you give me this, I will, I will offer so much. That's sort of giving back. Now, this isn't necessarily to be criticized. It's not the best understanding, perhaps, but there's something there. And even as Swami has said about the Vedas are full of mantras that can be repeated to give results in life. He says this is on a certain level, this is okay, because it's better that a person see everything is coming from God and asking God to give them those results than as if they didn't ask God. He says, so consequently, it's good. It's good on that level of a person's understanding is if I do so much, God, you'll do so much back for me. It's a bit of a mercenary relationship, but he says it's better. It's better than no relationship at all. But ultimately, we get to the point where we realize that as the title of our God has everything, he doesn't need anything from us. There's nothing he needs from us except one thing. And of course, what's the one thing? Love. Yeah, it's our love. He needs our love. He doesn't need our love. He wants our love. And this is how Master put it. And ultimately, the real sacrifice is not of these outward things, or these outward things are but of symbols, really, of something much more deeply within ourselves. What God is asking of us is us to relinquish this little sense of I, me, mine, this little sense of egotism, to be able to release that into God, release that, give that to God, give that and purify, let that be purified, let that become our offering to the divine. And then that's the best offering that we can give. And so when we sacrifice that, when we sacrifice this little sense of self, this little sense of I, this sense of ego which keeps us separate from God, can you really call that a sacrifice? It's a sacrifice, yes, but it's the answer to what all of us are seeking. When we sacrifice our separation from God, what are we really losing? We're losing that little sense of ego identity. Although it's interesting, I've read it said I can't remember where I've read it, but there is embedded within each of us a little fear of doing that, a little fear of giving ourselves up fully to God. It's the ego, that last, yes, as they say when practicing breath Hong Sa, that the breath comes to a stop and all of a sudden it wants to breathe again. Because the egos, there's a little bit of fear there. Oh my. And they say even, isn't it so that when in the autobiography of a yogi, when the messenger comes from Babaji and tells Lahiri that it's the time, that was Lahiri. That was that the time of his passing was drawing near. There was even Lahiri had just a momentary shudder until he centered himself, because he said when the soul is in the body for a length of time, it gets used to it. And then all of a sudden, when it realizes it's time to go, it's the little bit of ego that a master even needs to be able to hold himself in the body. It doesn't want to go. And so, but when we can release and learn to be able to sacrifice that, ultimately, that's the key to our freedom. That's ultimately the key to the ultimate sacrifice, which ultimately brings an end to all sufferings. Because it brings an end to that sense of separation. And so that struggle then is no more at that point, because there's no ego pulling us in that direction. The ego disappears, and then the struggle, we live in a state of grace. And that difficulty of getting up in the morning, you have to take it to the mundane level, it begins, we don't feel that sense of reluctance or whatever it is that pulls us away from what our true divine nature is. And ultimately, it turns around. And instead of sacrificing in a sense of loss, in a sense of giving up something, it actually turns into a desire to give everything to God. There's a story I told a couple of weeks ago. I was doing satsang in town. Some of you may have been there, a few. But I wanted to repeat the story because it came back to mind when I was talking about this, thinking of this topic. And this is the story of Swami Ramdas in the earlier part of the 20th century. And he was, if you know his story, he wandered about India for many years, just giving himself to God, repeating Ram Nam just over and over, Hari Ram, Krishna, Hari Ram, Hari Ram, Ram Ram. And he was in that continual state, and in the state of ecstasy. So whatever happened outwardly, he saw it as a manifestation of Ram. And he took it as Ram speaking to him. So if somebody would come up to him and invite him this way, he'd say, "Oh, it's Ram," so he'd go this way, and then something, and he'd do that until something else happened, and in little subtle ways, Ram guided him for many years of his life. All over India, he went to one place and things happened for him. But it wasn't easy. Other disciples said, "Oh, that's so wonderful. I want to do that too." And they tried to tag along with him, and it wasn't so easy because many of those nights he was in the very cold and would go long periods of time without food. And the other disciples that were tagging along, they realized, there's more to this, and that Ram just didn't all of a sudden feed him 3 meals a day on schedule. And many dropped away. But for Ram Dass, of course, it didn't matter at all, because everything, whether it was there or not there, was wrong. Well, there's one story from his latter part of his life where he ended up having disciples and people who would take care of him and watched out for him and so on in the latter part of his life. And he was in his kutir at night, and he was there, and his caretaker, people who were watching over him, were in another room elsewhere. And he was there in his kutir at night, and he was chanting to Ram. And a fellow comes into the room. He was a thief. Comes in. A robber comes into the room. And so Ram Dass says, welcome, sit, and fellow comes and sort of looks about, looks here, looks there, and notices Ram Dass was wearing some spectacles, and little golden spectacles. And he says, "Give me those. I want those." And Ram Dass, of course, because he saw before him Ram sitting there. He says, "Ram wants my spectacles. Oh, fantastic!" And he gives him his spectacles, and he just, and then he says, "Give me your shawl." And Ram Dass, it's right. And Ram wants my shawl, and he gave him the shawl, and his shirt, his dhoti, his little water pot, everything. He says, Ram wanted it all. And he says, Ram, take it. And then he took his loincloth and he took everything out of the room. And the next morning, his people who were caring for him, they came in and they look, and everything's gone. And there's Ram Dass sitting there with no clothes on, and he's just in ecstasy. And he says, "What happened?" He says, "Oh, brothers, it was Ram came last night. Sing with me. Ram came last night, and he came, and he wanted my spectacle, and he wanted clothes. I don't know why he wanted clothes, but he wanted these things, and he was just in this ecstatic state because Ram had come and wanted these things, and he could give him something. He could give him something, and in the giving, every time he gave something, more and more and more joy began to come up in him. And so when you look at it this way, what's the sacrifice? I mean, this is the state we want to be in, that when God has everything, what does he want? He doesn't want these outer things from us, but he does want our love. And if we can offer to God ourselves, God receives that offering, no matter, even as it says in the Gita, a leaf or a flower or whatever it is. When offered with love, God responds, and God accepts that offering, whatever it is. And this is the pure sense of offering, the pure sacrifice. But ultimately, those things are but representative and symbolic of something deep within inside ourselves. So with this, I was going to do this right now, but he hasn't come with the book yet. So we're going to have, today's the first day of the month. I'd like to do the festival on the first Satsang of the month. So we'll do that, and right at the conclusion of that, hopefully this book will show up, and we're going to do this brahmachari vow for Ricardo. But also I wanted to mention, I just thought in terms of it relating in the sense of sacrifice, but sacrifice in the best way, in the highest way. It's not a giving up of anything. It's an embracing of our desire to give everything to God. And if we live in that desire to give ourselves fully to God, then ultimately we ultimately are fulfilled in the highest way. But day to day, that has to be expressed and is expressed every day in the little choices that we're made, because every day we have choices to look up to the highest or to follow the ball rolling downhill in its natural direction and just going with what's easy. Often in my life, I've often been confronted with the choice and to accomplish something, even in worldly affairs, an easy way and a hard way. Now, sometimes I take the easy way because it'd be stupid to just always not, if something's obviously easy. But there's always a part of my mind that doesn't trust the easy way. And when you're looking at the two, there's a hard way, and I somehow, if I'm going to pick the easy way, I have to think about it, because the mind follows the heart. And the heart is going to, uncontrolled, unguided, guided by impulse, guided by desire, habits, is going to tend to want to go the easy way. And at the expense, perhaps, of what might be right, what might be better, but doggone, it's harder. So when it's 6 o'clock next Thursday, or 5:30, or whatever it is when you get up and you want to put that cover back over your head, think about that. And we'll see you at the morning meditation. Okay? Now, let's have our festival of light. Okay? And then we'll come back. If he doesn't come back toward the end, somewhere, go find him. It's just that book, it's the Renunciate book.